All right, everyone, welcome back. This is Lecture 18, Part 3. We will be talking about Nintendo GameCube. That's the last console of this era to uh, come out. This is the only sort of era in the history of video games where we have four game consoles. We start with Sega Dreamcast, then PlayStation 2, then Xbox, and now GameCube. So what happens after the Nintendo 64? Nintendo had fallen to second place behind the original PlayStation, and part of this was because they chose to use cartridges and they lost third-party support. Companies like SquareSoft went to make Final Fantasy VII for PlayStation instead of Nintendo. And while their first parties always continued to perform strongly, other games really struggled. So as they developed the GameCube, Nintendo told game developers and gamers that they had learned from their mistakes. But then the first thing they do is decide they're not going to use cartridge, which everyone is like, great. But rather than use the standard DVDs, they use these little mini discs that only hold 1.5 gigabytes of data. Keep in mind that everybody else is using these DVDs, right, that hold 7.6 gigabytes of data. So game developers for the PlayStation and Xbox are used to having 5 times as much data available to them as is available on a Nintendo disc. So this is a big issue right off the bat. Now, Nintendo did this partially to prevent piracy because it's one of their big concerns. But they also their games didn't require, the first party games didn't require that level of scale. And so Nintendo didn't worry about it too much. The console itself is designed to be portable. It has this cute little handle so you can take it over to Timmy's house or Sally's house, wherever you need to go. It has no convergence features whatsoever. It doesn't do anything but play GameCube games. As a result, it's cheaper than the other two systems, but it's much less functional. Nintendo GameCube very seriously suffered from being painted as sort of your little sibling's game console, right? Or my first game console compared to the PlayStation and Xbox, right? It doesn't play DVD movies. It doesn't connect to the internet. It could connect to the internet. They did release a adapter for it, but it was used for almost nothing outside of some Mario Kart Double Dash. And so it really struggled. And we'll talk about what happens here. So it comes out in 2001. Notice that it's only 199 bucks, so it is 100 to $150 cheaper than the other consoles. Uses external memory cards. You could connect it to the Game Boy Advance, which was the Nintendo handheld of this era. It had an HD cable and a modem, but again, these were very rarely used and not very well supported. In an unsurprising move, Nintendo sold you a Nintendo GameCube to get you to buy Nintendo games. Nintendo promised better third-party support, but the first-party titles are what drives their consoles, particularly sequels to Nintendo things. So we got Super Mario Sunshine, we got a version of Mario Kart Double Dash. There's a Super Smash Bros. Melee, I believe, is the title for this era. Metroid Prime. There's an F-Zero game. So a lot of first-party titles that you would expect. Their big Legend of Zelda title for this system was Wind Waker. Sorry about the misspelling on the title there in the slide. But notice that this is a clip. This is a drawing of it here, right? It has this sort of cartoon styling, right? It just sort of reinforces the idea that this is a kiddie system. It did have a couple of unique things. There's a Legend of Zelda Four Swords game that used the Game Boy Advance connectivity feature where if all of you had Game Boy Advances, you could connect them to the Game Boy and use them as controllers with extra screens and stuff, which is kind of nifty. But that certainly wasn't the case for most folks. It is notable that there are Nintendo franchises made by other companies in this era. So Sega made the F-Zero game, Namco made the Star Fox Dinosaur Planet Adventure game. So they were continuing that trend that they'd started in the N64 era with Rare of letting other trusted companies make games with their intellectual property. But at the end of the day, Nintendo follows their strategy of we make Nintendo hardware to sell you Nintendo games. It did promise better third-party support, but it was one of the GameCube's biggest weaknesses. Remember that Sony PlayStation 2 is living off of enormous amounts of third-party support. Grand Theft Auto, which is the biggest franchise in gaming during this era, has no game whatsoever on the Nintendo GameCube. That's a really big weakness. Remember that the average gamer is now in their early to mid 20s. They like Mario. They played Mario when they're a kid. It was great, but the average gamer maybe doesn't want to play Mario anymore, and they certainly don't want a cartoony Zelda when there are other options available. So Capcom, for example, is a good example of what happened. Capcom promised they were going to make some exclusive GameCube games, things like Resident Evil 4 and Beautiful Joe, Killer 7, stuff like this. And they did, but because sales of the GameCube were so poor, they almost always ended up porting these over to the PlayStation 2 and possibly the Xbox. WWE wrestling games were still very popular. Um, that was one of the shining third party examples on the system, but they are very few and far in between. We'll take a look at just a couple of GameCube games on the stream, probably just Mario Sunshine. Super Mario Sunshine is a great game, but after the revolution that was Super Mario 64, it was hard not to feel a little let down, I think, by even a very solid Mario title. And then the third party support was just a killer in this era when Grand Theft Auto is so big and so popular, and you have none of those games on your system. And really, that's all we're going to talk about with the GameCube. It's going to finish third in this generation of consoles. This is a very low point for Nintendo. Despite their long history in the game industry. Remember, they've been in the business now since the early 80s. They led for nearly a decade before the PlayStation came along in the mid 90s, and suddenly they have the worst selling game console of the era, discounting the Sega Dreamcast since it was discontinued. It did have better third-party support than the N64 because they didn't use cartridges, but GameCube had nowhere near the third-party support of the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. So if you go back to the Entertainment Software Association sales data for this era, if you look at the 2005 best-selling games, GameCube has no titles at all in the top 20 sales for the last year of this era. That kind of indicates how poorly this went for Nintendo. Now, GameCube was much more successful in Japan than the US. This is very similar to how Xbox and Nintendo have sort of gone back and forth in the two territories. One of the issues that happened though, because GameCube's focus on cartoony and cute and accessible games really did lead to it having that perception of being a kiddie system or system for little kids, right? You would have, elementary school kids could play Nintendo games, right? Hopefully, we wouldn't let them play Grand Theft Auto on our Xboxes at the time. One thing that came out of this that's very interesting though is that as this generations of consoles went on, Nintendo started saying gaming has become too complex and the game should focus on fun and ease of play as opposed to realistic graphics and complicated controls. So Nintendo looked at what was happening to games and game development and seeing these very expensive to produce games, these very big games, things like Grand Theft Auto or Final Fantasy X or what have you, and said, is this the right way for games to go? Do you really want the game industry to spend all its time and energy driving better graphics so the carpet can look more realistic as you walk across the floor of a game that most gamers aren't even going to pay attention to? Nintendo said that Sony and Microsoft were driving down sort of a dead end road, and what games should do is focus on being fun and being really easy to play so that everyone can game. And this is a really interesting contrast, and we'll see how they implement this first in the portable market, and then they go on in the next generation of consoles to kind of take this idea to its full potential with the Nintendo Wii. So big takeaways for the GameCube. It's sort of a low point for Nintendo. They're bottom in sales. This isn't to say the GameCube doesn't have some excellent games on it. It sure does. There are things like the first party games, uh, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the Beautiful Joe games. There's a lot of good titles on the GameCube, but they just did not sell as well as they did if they ported them to another console. And they certainly didn't have the user base that like the PlayStation 2 with its 150 million consoles sold. So again, it just is sort of a low point for Nintendo. But they take this low point, and we'll see down the road here how they're going to take the lessons they're learning here, or the things that they say are happening to gaming, and sort of turn everything on its head with the Wii and the DS. All right, well, that's it for the GameCube. Again, pretty brief, and I hope I covered it enough. And if you had a favorite GameCube game, I'm not in any way trying to slight the system. It's good from a technical perspective. It's a good little system. It just had the disadvantage of being sort of positioned as a kid system or viewed as a kid system at a time when gaming was trying to be grown up and all edgy and dark with the Grand Theft Auto and realistic graphics and super ultra violence and stuff like that. So that's it for lecture 18. We'll come back with lecture 19 and talk about the portable market in this era and then talk about PC gaming. All right, I hope everybody's well. Bye bye.